Hey guys, this is Purna and we are continuing reactjs training session, and today we are discussing use reducer. So we already have a session on reducer basics on part 1. So this is the continuation of that previous session. Basically it's a part 2. Here we will discuss about how to use reducer and context both in our React project. As you know, prop drilling is not a right way to code in React, right? So unnecessary we pass property data from one component to other, even though they don't need to do anything with those data, right? So to avoid the prop drilling, basically we use context. So React context API, we can use that for managing the global state, and we can use it with use state hook. So use context is a React hook that lets you read and subscribe the context from your component, and React context API can help to avoid prop drilling that we already discussed. To explore this reducer and context in a single project, right? So we will build a to-do app. There we'll use context along with reducer, and basically the plan would be like we'll create a to-do app using normal state, use state. Then we will remove that use state and we'll introduce reducer. So once the program started working, then we will split those component into separate component. So when multiple components come for a single responsibility, then we need a global state. So in that context we'll use context with reducer to manage things in a standardized way. So that we will learn today. I built this to-do app in a simple component file, and I'm simply using state here. So I'll be using reducer here along with the context API, so that we can split this component into different files. So one is for the container, the other one is add to do, and I'll have one more component for to do list. Let's understand this code. Basically in this to do list.js file I've written everything. So here you can see, right, there is a state variable to do items. So we are using some default items. So if I expand that, you will see I have two to do object. Basically have to go to hospital for routine checkup, and the other one is I have a meeting with US client, and it has also few other properties like ID is active is true and is deleted is false. So based on this two status I am doing some other things, and I have one more state like input values. So basically it is used to capture the new to dos. There are events like add to do or delete to do or complete to do. So if I expand one, you will see, right, so I am capturing that input values and adding a new items, right? Here I have used spread to expand it, along with I am pushing a new item. So in case of delete, I am not exactly deleting the to do item from the list, but I am just updating the status as is deleted true. And so like that complete to do. So here I am updating the is active property false. So when we created a to do, basically it is active and it will comes in a green color, and when let's say we complete the to do checklist, probably we are just graying out that one, and if you are deleting that, we are just putting a strike. So like that I have two component here, rendered to dos. So here all to dos will be rendered, and there is one more component like render add to dos. So this is a very lengthy component, but instead of showing everything, I will upload this code into my GitHub account, so you guys can download it. So if you go inside this function, or you can say it's a component, basically it's returning a JSX code, right? So here you can see, right, I have a input box, and whenever I'm changing any value, it's called handle input value change. So that will update the value of this input value state, And when the input values text length is greater than 2, it means 3 character length, then this button will be enabled, otherwise always it is disabled to add. And after adding a to-dos, I am clearing that text of the text box. Here also you can see, right, this to-do items dot map. So basically it's a loop to render the number of to-dos available inside this state. Based on the number of items available, it's called the render to-do. So if you go to this render to-do component, basically what I am doing here, right, in this functional component, I am returning JSX code, and it is just showing a alert container. This dynamic CSS basically I am applying based on the state, whether it is active or inactive. When it is active, I am showing a alert box which is success background, basically the green color background. And if it is inactive, then it's a secondary, so it looks like a default, not much highlighted, right? So these are some bootstrap class that you guys can go through it. I got the dynamic CSS and I applied that alert box here. Inside that I am binding this to-dos description. Below we have two buttons here. One is for completing the to-do list, and the other one is for deleting the to-do list. Now let's see the output of this component and do some operations. So you can see here, right, so I have two default component, as I told you, right. There is an array that hold two to-do items, and if you click on this right symbol basically, so it will complete the to-dos. And if you want to delete it, just click the delete, so it will just give a strike, right. I am adding one more to-dos here. So if I click on that, you can see like I am learning React. Let's say create one more to-do. It's a reducer session. Like this, we can add n number of to-dos here, and if you want to delete it, just simply delete it. The to-dos is deleted. So once you click delete, right, so these two buttons are grayed out, and if you click on complete to-dos, basically the delete is still active, but it will just remove the highlighter, so that you can easily identify like this is my active to-do, so we need to complete it. I will be converting this to-dos app using reducer and use context. So let me share the whiteboard. So I'll create three components. So the first component is to-do app, and the second one is add to-do. The third component is to-do list, right? So this will work like a container here, and under this I will call this to component. So if you will not use context API, right, what will happen, right? So I'll have to pass the data from here to here. If you will not use context API, then we have to pass the props here or here, and let's say we have some n number of component, right? So everywhere we have to pass the props, right? So from top to bottom, I need a props here in this, and if we are not using the global state, so what we'll have to do, right? So we have to pass the props from top to bottom, so one by one. Even there is no use of properties in this component, still we are passing through because we need that props in one of the child component. So just to avoid these things, we are using context. And if you are using context with the use reducer, then it is kind of a complete package. Even though without using Redux also, we can achieve the Redux kind of features and more faster, but Redux has some additional functionalities, so that is the reason we need to look into it. But if someone knows reducers well, then that will help them to understand the Redux more easily. We will pass a context here. We'll consume that context in to-do list, and from the add to-dos, right, we will dispatch a action. From to-do list also we will dispatch few action. So what are the possible actions that we are going to perform here? So here it will be like add to-dos, and from the to-do list what are the possible actions, like complete and delete, right? So these are the two actions we will dispatch from to-do list, and the other one is add to-dos from add to-do component. So we will follow two steps to convert our to-do app. First, we will use reducer. Once the component started working, then we will use context. Okay. So let's implement the reducer first, then we'll use context. So what we'll have to do here, right? First, let me create a new file for initial state data.js. So what exactly we will do here, right? We will remove this piece of code to here. Let's create an initial state, something like initial state data, where it will have two state properties, like to do items and input values. Then export default this initial state data. Now let me create one more file, reducer.js. Now let's create a reducer function. In this reducer functions, we'll have two parameters, state and action. And there are different type of actions, like action type add to-dos, complete to-dos, delete to-dos, and set input value. So if you go to this to-do list, right, you can see we have two state, right, like to-do item, input values, right, and we have different activities we are performing, like add to-dos, delete to-do, and complete to-do. So for all this activities, I have created a few actions, like complete to do, delete to do, and add to do, along with the set input values. So if you see, this functions takes two parameters, state and action. Based on the action, it performs some activities and return a new state. So why I spreaded this state here? Because we will update the value of the state based on the actions. So let's explore this functions add to do, what it is exactly doing. So in these functions, we are just adding a new to do with the existing to do item state. And in the delete, what exactly we are doing? We are just updating the property is deleted inside the to do item states, and is active false. Likewise, in complete to do list, we are updating the is active false. So here these two things are common, and is deleted is something extra that we are updating in delete to do list. So what I will do, I'll create a function to change the state values based on the complete and delete action. So here's the functions, like get updated to do items. So if you see this function, right, it has three parameters: items, id and type. So item represents the current state values of the to do item, and id is the particular items we are performing the complete or delete, and the type is the activities what we are performing, that action type, basically the complete to do and delete to do. Based on that, we are updating that updated items and returning that one. So let's say if you want to perform this, what we will have, what we'll have to do, right? So like, okay, so let me use that functions for complete to do's. To do items to do's state dot to do items, then action dot payload. We will pass a payload with that, so that will hold okay. Likewise, we need to copy this and do the same with the delete as well, but here the action type will be changed. Okay, this is done. What we are doing with add to do's. So with add to do's, we have to do here like state dot to do items, and let's skip the payload before, so that it will be the first item over this state. Okay, so what next is set input values. So what to do here, basically let me go back to the to do list, and when we are changing the event, so it will change the input value. So what is the initial state? It has input value, right? So here let's give input values equal to action dot payload. Okay, this is what the reducer looks like, and let me export it. Export default reducer. Okay, so my reducer is ready now. Let me go to this to-do list, and instead of using use state, I will use reducer. Okay, and also I will have to fetch that initial state. So what I will have to do, like initial state data, let me take this, and let's remove this values for now. We don't need these things now. So let me declare the reducer hook. Okay, so I declare the reducer here. Let me save this, and instead of this, right, handle change, basically what I will do, so here I will call dispatch. In dispatch, it will take action. So in action, I have two parameters. One is type is a string basically, and it's not value, it's a payload. payload is my event tag. So let me go back to the reducer and we'll see what I'm doing. Like the action is set input values basically. So let me define the type set input value. So this is how we will call the dispatch. Okay, and this state, we are going to use this state wherever we have to do's item. So to do items. Okay, there are multiple places we have to do item. So what we will do, state dot to do item, let me directly replace here. So let me copy this, pass this add to do's. So what is the actions that we have defined for add to do? Add underscore to do's. So let me change this to add to do, and in case of the payload I'll have to pass this object, right? So the new object. Now let me remove the other piece of code. Okay, the add to do is clear. In case of delete, this piece of code already I have moved to my reducer function. So let me keep it like this, and in case of this value I will use id and I need to change the reducer type to complete to do's. Sorry, this is delete, so it will be like delete to do's. Okay, the same thing let me copy for complete as well. So I believe I have modified this code to use reducer and its default data instead of using the local state. Okay, so let me run this and see. Wow. Okay, so this input value is not finding, it means, okay, let me change this because this input value also moved to the state, right? So now let's save this, and now it's working with reducer. Okay, now let me add a new to do, hello world. Awesome. Okay, so the clears is not happening. Basically when we are heading, it should clear, right? So there is something wrong we have done. So let me check what is happened here while adding. Okay, so we need to set this input value as blank in case of this add, right? Let's say hello world. Wow, now it's clear, right? So button is disabled, right? Okay, one more to do. Gajaf. Okay, so now let me complete a to do's. Oh, it's working fine. Let me delete a to do's, that is also working fine. Complete this again and then we delete it, so these things are working fine. So our code is now moved from state to reducer. Here you can see, right? I have no more used anywhere the use state hook, so it is completely reducer now. So guys, if you see, right, I have already convert my state based component, the to do's list, right, using reducer now. So this is already done. So what we have to do now, right? So I will have to work for the context. So why we need context basically? So context needed when you want to manage the global state. And what is the need of global state? So if you see now, right? So we have to do list. One single component is there. So here everything, all the code, right? Like add, listing, then reducer is separate file that already we have done, like reducer is the separate file, and the default state, right? Default state. So these two things are already separated, but still this to-do list is working for end-to-end. So in real world applications, what happen, right? So this to-do list has a scope to have different component, like we will separate this to something like add to-dos, then to-do list, right? So we will create two new component, like to-dos and add to-dos and to-do list, and this will be part of one more component that is called to-dos app. So basically we need those to-dos data in multiple component. So instead of passing that data as props, I will use context. Okay, so now let's see how we can do these things. So we will store this data in using context, and we will consume this context data in add to dos and also in to dos list, right? Okay, so for this we have to create a new file, add to dos component and to do list component. This will be specific to there. So here I have created a new component, add to dos. So let me take this piece of code to add to dos. Let me paste here, add to dos. Let me remove this function, find the component, so it is not needed. So instead of using that, I will use like add to do. I will call this add to do here, and we'll see, but I believe there would be some error. Okay, so there are so many error came because that reducer is not there. Okay, let me pull that related code for add to dos, like add to do click and the input value change. These two things is not required here. So this to do list component will be very specific to rendering the list instead of bothering all those things. So I will keep it here. Okay, let's see, there are some error reduce. No. Okay, so guys, in order to use context API in React component, right? So first we have to create a context. So it will be like create something like to do list context, React create context. Then so what we will do here, right? So this to do list, basically what we were calling this to, that initial state data and reducer, right? So we will call those two things in this container component, and let's move this piece of code to state and dispatch to this container component again, to do app. Basically, in order to use this context, we need a context provider, and use something like and this provider takes a value as attribute. Let's define some values, right? So values, const values. So basically we are exposing a object to the children component, right? So what are the things that they can use, right? Basically to do list. So if you see here, right, they are using to do item. So let me define this to do item here. So this will be it's a property, so colon to do item means state dot to do items. Okay, then what are the functions we are using here in dispatch basically? Okay, so let me create a function for this dispatch. So we will not expose this dispatch to the children component. So instead of doing that, I will put those code in container basically. So what I will do, right, what I have deleted here, delete, right? Okay, so delete to do, this is a function basically, and it gives a ID. Based on this, dispatch delete ID. Okay, so like this I will have one more like complete to do, the same complete to do also. So here what we will do, right, we will copy this dispatch to the container complete to do. Okay, now this is done. So there is one more function for add to dos as well, right? So it's like add to do is something, there is a parameter called input values, right? Input value, sorry. So basically I am creating some function here. So I will just pass this function to my child component, and those child component will call that function instead of actually dispatching something. Okay, we don't need any parameter there, so no parameter required because the state already have the values for add to do, and there is something set input value, right? Set input value, this is also a function, and this is the input value. We will call that dispatch. Okay, here so this input value I will replace here. Okay, so In this set input values, I pass that input values, and if someone want to access these values, basically these values is passed with my context provider. How to consume this context? Let me remove this dispatch code from here. Add to-dos, and from the to-do list all the things are removed now, right? So there is no use of reducer here. So instead of that, we will use context. So one more thing we have to do is this to-do list, right? To-do context. So let me create a file, to-do list context.js, and let me create a file and export it. Export default to-do list context. Okay, so I'll have to use that context here. Import to-do list context. Okay, so the same import I have to do there as well in to-do list, and we don't need this reducer here and initial data, right? So what we will do, right, this use context will be used, and instead of that reducer parameters, so I will use to-do list context, and from here we will fetch those events basically. So what are the event? We will fetch the event using a destructive mechanism. So these are the two functions basically we are using here, right? So in complete to do, I will pass complete to do, and let me pass the ID, and for delete to do, and I will pass the ID. So we need to fetch the to do items as well, because the state is no more available here. So let me okay, so something like state dot to dos. I'll have to replace those with this to dos item. Okay, I believe I have remove those reducer related function from the to-do list. So similar thing I have to do here as well in add to-dos. Let me use this context, and this is the way you can fetch the to-dos. So what we need here basically, set input values and add to-dos. These two function we need to use. So what we will do here, like event target dot values, we need these things. So likewise for add to dos also we have to directly call it, because this already have this set input value, so we don't need to pass anything. So let me check any state use here. Yes, the state input value is used. So I need to fetch this input value as well. So dot input values, instead of doing that I will just replace this as input values. Okay, so let me see here, do we have something called input values also? No, there is no input values. So I'll have to expose that data from here as well, otherwise it will give error. State dot input value. So let me move this because these are the objects and others are like functions. So let me save it. I believe these things will work now. Let me see what is wrong here. Okay, use context is not defined. So use context is not defined. Okay, here I need to define the use context. Use context. So it is saying to do app use reducer is not defined. Okay, to do app this container component, I'll have to use reducer. Now let's see something there missing. Okay, to do list context react is not defined. Import react from react. I believe things will work now. Wow. Okay, so let me add a new to do's. Awesome. One more to do's. Very good. Let me complete it. Let me delete something. Let me delete the already completed file. So this is working as expected. Explain the code what I have done. So this index.js is the todoapp container basically. So here what exactly I am doing, right? So I am calling this reducer and this initial state data. So if you see this reducer, right? So this reducer file has a reducer function. So basically this is the function I was talking, which used to take a state as the input parameter and also the action. So state represents the actual data and the action is like what to do with the state when we dispatch something, right? So action tells like what to do. Basically this actions types are like add to do's, complete to do's, delete to do's, and set input values, right? So if you see here, right, when we are setting up this reducer, so we are setting some initial state data. So initially this component has two to do items already into the array, and in initial state data we are just using those items and input values is blank. So if you see here this index.js, right, here I'm calling this use reducer and I'm passing that reducer function and the initial state data. So here my reducer is set off, right? So as I have to use the context, because I have splitted that existing to-do list component into three components basically. One is the container component to do app, then to-do list, and also one more new one, add to-dos. So as the prop drilling is not a right way to writing code in React, so just to avoid that I have used context. So as we are using use context here, the context API, so the reducer moved to the container, and in order to use the context API, right, so first we need to create a context object. So if you go here, the to-do list context, here we are creating the context object, and inside this index.js I fetch that context object, and based on the context I'm using its context provider and passing some values, and inside that context provider I pass my children's or child component who are going to use this context data, and here I am passing a values, and these values is exposing the data from the reducer, right? So as I said, right, reducer is a reducer is kind of a state management for the complex data, So if you see this reducer has, these are the things, right? So like the to-dos items, input values, and there are some actions that I'm triggering the display. So I created object values. Inside that I pass the data from the reducer state directly, and these are the functions that I have created as the properties for this values object, like add to dos, delete to dos, complete to do, and set input values, where I am using the dispatch. So this dispatch was earlier written in to-dos list.js, but I moved those code or those dispatch related code into this container component, right? And created the abstraction method on top of that. Based on the method, I am calling those dispatch here in one centralized place. And this values I have passed or shared to my child component through the context provided. So if somebody want to use this values, so they have to consume this context, this to-do list context. So if you go to this to-do list, so here I have removed all that reducer related code and dispatch related code. So the only thing I have used here, right, I am just using the to-do list context, and that to-do list context I am extracting the inner properties which I said in the provider, right? Like to-do items and the complete to do and delete to do, these are the two methods, and one is the state data. So this to-do items that I am using below, and based on this to-do item, my loops is executing, and I am rendering the to-do one list item basically, and here it has a alert, and that alert is there. I already explained this code. And this complete to do's and delete to do, basically it performs some dispatch activities in the container component, but here it's just a function, so we just need to call, just like callback functions we used to pass through the props, right? If you are not using this context kind of stuff. So this is just a callback functions that I passed as a reference, and here I am calling which earlier I used to write the dispatch. So similarly, if you go to this add to dos also, right, here I didn't written anything related to the reducer or context, and here the values are different: input values, set input values, and add to do. This is a function, and this set input value is also a function. So when there is a value change in this text box, this set input values event is or function is called, and I'm passing that values associated in this to dos. And this add to do click function is calling to the add to do directly, and we don't need to pass anything because this set input value is already holding the data in the input values. And why I need this input values? The input value is here to resolve in the input box or the text box, and also this button is controlled through this. If the length is 3 or more, the character length, then only this add to do button is enabled to execute. This is what the implementation that I have done. We can create n number of to dos now here, right? And it is working with all the complete and delete to dos also. This is all about the session today. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment and share. Please subscribe my channel.